So thank you for inviting me today. So the idea for the next 40 minutes or so is I'll give you an overview of synthetic data generation, how it works, how to apply it in practice. I'll focus on the work that we have done, but I think that's representative of the work that's being done in general in this area. And this is all the work has been published, so I'll be giving you references along the way so you can follow up or get more details for the methods and results that I'll be presenting. So synthetic data generation is essentially generative AI, and you've seen and heard a lot about generative AI recently. The big advancements in generative AI were initially in imaging. So this is space opera theater, which is an image that was generated using one of these AI models. And this won the Colorado State Fair Fine Arts Competition, competing against multiple paintings by real artists. And of course, having a machine-generated image, which looks quite creative, winning a fine arts competition raised a lot of eyebrows and brought into the debate or the discourse whether generative AI can be creative, and but also highlights the quality and the realism of data that can be generated from these generative models. You've also seen generative AI in the context of fake images. So these are just examples of fake images that were generated from models that were trained on a bank of real images. And they look very realistic. Various studies with members of the public, asking them what they can tell the difference between real and fake images, found that they couldn't really tell the difference, and they trusted the fake images more than the real images, which raises a lot of questions about, well, about trust and also about how fake data or fake images can be a proxy for real ones. Nevertheless, the technology is there. It can produce realistic looking paintings and facial images quite well. This has, of course, been extended to audio and video and text. For our purposes today, we will focus on data, health data, structured data that essentially is in rows and columns. And the same principles apply. So you start off with a source data set of some sort here. This could be a real-world data set or a clinical trial data set. You train a generative model here. There are many different types of generative models, but they essentially aim to learn the patterns in the original data, and as many the simple and complex patterns in the original data. And then you would use the model to generate new data. That's the synthetic data. And so synthetic data is generated from the model. It's not generated directly from transforming the data. You train the model, and then you trigger it in some way to get it to generate new data sets. You don't really need to know how the synthetic data will be used to generate useful synthetic data. The synthetic data that's produced can look very realistic. It'll have the same distribution, same variable name, same structure as the same variable types, same meet the same conditions as the original data. Because it's generated from a model, there isn't a one-to-one mapping between the synthetic data and the source data, and between the synthetic data and real people. So this is why synthetic data can have good privacy properties. One of the questions is, how large does the source data have to be? It depends. Of course, it depends on the number of variables in your source data. If you have 5 variables, then your data set can be smaller. If you have 1,000 variables, then your data set has to be larger. It's the same issue with any modeling exercise. And then, of course, it can scale to large data sets as well. And a key characteristic, like I said, is that you don't really need to know how the synthetic data will be used in order to still produce useful synthetic data with high utility. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. So the way you generate synthetic data, or you train a generative model, the basic principles are more or less the same across different techniques. So you essentially have some kind of generator here. That's the first step. So this could be a statistical machine learning model or a neural network, artificial neural network, which ingests the real data. And then it tries to learn the patterns in the real data and generates synthetic data. And then you have an evaluator here, which compares the synthetic data with the real data and computes utility metrics here and privacy metrics here. So utility measures how good synthetic data is, the quality of the synthetic data, and then privacy assesses the privacy risks of the synthetic data. You can compute a score from utility only or utility and privacy from the evaluator, and then this is fed back to the generator to tune its parameters. So you go through this iterative process until you reach a data set that has good performance on the evaluator, has a good balance between utility and privacy, or if you're only focusing on utility, then one that maximizes utility. An alternative structure is where your generator does not ingest the real data, it ingests random data, so maybe a Gaussian distribution of some sort, and will convert that random input into synthetic data, and then that's compared, and then you iterate until you reached some stopping criterion, and at that point you have a generator that can produce good enough synthetic data. So these are the two general architectures that are used. There are many different ways to define a generator and many different ways to define an evaluator. But these are the basic principles, and in practice it works quite well. So one of the big use cases, as I alluded to earlier on, relate to privacy. You have internal synthetic data can protect the privacy of individuals for internal data sharing and external data sharing and internal data reuse. So the use cases we've seen are for external are collaborations with partners. So you share data with collaborators, whether it's in academia, government, or industry. Some companies use synthetic data to vendor evaluations, so essentially to pilot studies. And then for another big use case is outsourcing, where data is given to a back office subcontractor to do work on that, and that can be somewhere offshore. And then internal reuse for training machine learning models, for software testing and training. These are the commonly seen use cases. We use synthetic data for teaching, for example, at the university. We can generate realistic synthetic data sets, give it to the students, and because we can generate as large synthetic data sets as we want, we're not limited to the size of the original data, that we can have them train machine learning models on big data, for example, and use synthetic data for that purpose. But of course, that rests on the assumption that data has low privacy risks. So there are two main kinds of privacy risks that are relevant and defensible for synthetic data. The first one is what I'll call attribution disclosure. Basically, you can think of this table as being a synthetic data set. You have a bunch of quasi-identifiers. So these are the variables that an attacker would know, like sex and year of birth. And then if an attacker is successful, they will learn new information about a person, in this case, the NDC code, the drug code. So imagine here we have a person in the real world. Let's call her Sally. Sally is a female who was born in 1989. So here we have a match with the synthetic data. This is not really Sally's record, because synthetic record, but it's a record that matches Sally's information on the quasi-identifiers. So once we have a matching record, that's essentially a digital twin or a similar looking record to Sally on the quasi-identifiers, then we look at the information here, the new information. And if this new information, in this case, the NDC, if this information is correct, then we've learned something new about Sally from the synthetic data. And if the NDC record is or value is not correct, then this is not really an attribution disclosure. So we found a similar record, but it's not, we cannot use the information in the similar record to learn something correct about Sally. So that's the concept of attribution disclosure, and you can quantify this and assign it a probability of finding a successful record match in the synthetic data and learning something new about Sally from that match. The second type of privacy risk that is commonly considered for synthetic data is called membership disclosure. So what membership disclosure means is if I have a population here, so say a population of patients, and then some sample of that is produced, and then this sample here is used to create synthetic data, and then we have a synthetic data set from that sample. At the same time, an attacker draws another sample from the same population, and let's say this person here is Sally, and what the attacker wants to know is whether this person here, this Sally in the attack data set, was in the real data set here, was part of the training data set. So membership of Sally to the training data set is a member of the training data set. So that's called membership disclosure. And the reason this is potentially disclosure risk is if the real data set consists of people who participate in a particular study or have a particular disease, or who have received a particular treatment, then you learn something new about Sally. Even though you don't know which record belongs to Sally, you still learn something new about Sally. And so there are ways to evaluate this as well. How can you use the synthetic data to determine if Sally is in the training data set? That's called membership disclosure. So as you can see, this is a very different way of thinking about privacy compared to traditional anonymization or traditional re-identification attacks, where we're not really trying to find the record that belongs to Sally. We're trying to see if we can use the synthetic data to learn information about Sally, either an attribute in the data set, to get a correct value for an attribute in the data set about Sally, or whether she was part of the training data set. So these are the types of disclosures that are relevant for synthetic data. So first key thing to note about synthetic data generation is that generative models, the ones we're talking about here for structured data, they cannot guarantee that the generated data will always have low privacy risks depending on how they're generated, but irrespective, we can measure the privacy risks of the generated synthetic data. So we can tell when we get a synthetic data whether the privacy risks are high or low, because we can quantify that risks, those risks, I think, reasonably well. It's not perfect, but I think we can quantify those risks reasonably well. And if the risks are low, then you can say, well, this data set has low privacy risks, and then you can use it and disclose it for secondary purposes because it's not deemed to be personal information anymore. Okay, and then the other aspect of synthetic data is utility, which is how good is it? How good? How what's the quality of the synthetic data that's generated? So there are at least 3 ways to evaluate this. One is expert discrimination. So that basic idea here is you can say create a data set of 50 real records and 50 synthetic records, shuffle them, and then give them to clinician and then see if they can tell a difference. If they can tell difference, then your synthetic data has low utility, but if they can't tell difference, then the synthetic data has high utility. So that's a basic idea. But the expert discrimination takes time and money, and is not scalable. Fidelity is you look at the joint distribution or the multivariate distribution of the synthetic data and the real data and compare them. So there are different ways to compare multivariate distributions, and if they're similar, then that's good because that indicates that the utility is high. And if they're different, then that's bad because it means that utility is low, that the fidelity of the synthetic data is not high. It hasn't been able to replicate the distributions in the original data. We're not talking about marginal distributions. We can look at more complex definition of what a joint distribution is. And then the last type of metric or approach to evaluate synthetic data is replicability. So whether you're able to replicate the results, analysis results on synthetic data using real data, and whether the analysis on synthetic data allows you to draw valid inferences. So we'll look at all of those in a moment. So in principle, fidelity should be predictive of replicability in the sense that if I have a high fidelity data set and I can quantify this fidelity, then I should be able to, with confidence, say, well, the high fidelity data set will also have a high replicability. To do a replicability study, you need to have a particular analysis in mind, and sometimes you don't know that. You don't know what analysis you're going to do. So in that case, you would try to use a typical analysis for that type of data, or just use fidelity metrics as a way to predict replicability. So that's the basic idea of how you evaluate the utility of synthetic data. So let's look at some results here about replicability of results. The basic idea is you create a real data set and a synthetic data set. You perform the same analysis on both. So here you'd have a particular analysis in mind, and you would form exactly the same analysis on the real synthetic, and then you would compare the results and see if the results or the findings from both analyses are the same. And if they are the same, then you can say that the synthetic data is able to replicate the results of the real data. So I'll give you just some early studies that we did, and I'll highlight some things we've learned from that. So this is one study we did during COVID, and we looked at the Public Health Agency COVID positive results. This is only for Ontario. And so time 0 is the 1st of January 2020, and this was around the end of November, first 300 days of the COVID-19 pandemic. And here we build a machine learning model to try to predict mortality. And so this is a conditional partial dependence plot, essentially factors out the other variables and looks at the relationship between dates and mean predicted probability of death. And it's a relatively complex model. It's a gradient boosted decision tree. And you can see that the real and synthetic data, and the gray part is the 95% confidence interval. The real and synthetic data followed each other quite closely for a complex, for quite a complex model, capturing the relationships to predict this outcome. And then here's another analysis from the same data set. In this case, we're looking at age group and then at mortality. And again, you have the point estimates and the 95% confidence interval, and you can see strong concordance between the real and synthetic data. It definitely captures the main patterns, and the differences in the estimates are not very large. So indicating the general patterns that you'd expect to see between the real and synthetic data sets. Again, for quite a complex machine learning model that was trained on both of these. So that was encouraging in the sense that we're able to replicate the results. And the numbers up here are the confidence interval overlap. So in this case, 72.6% of the average confidence interval intervals overlap between the real and synthetic data. So this is encouraging, but this is a relatively straightforward, essentially cross-sectional analysis. Here we looked at a different study done with our colleagues at the University of Alberta. So here, the objective was to look at different outcomes for individuals in Alberta who were using opioids. So the data set that we used to train a generative model was for about 100,000 individuals. And so it's a longitudinal data set over 7 years, demographics, and then we had drugs, ED visits, hospital admissions, and lab tests. And here we can see that the different variables that were included in each one of those tables. And in this case, we used an LSTM, so it's a kind of recurrent neural network deep learning method to train the model. For time, we cut it off at 1,000 events per person. After 1,000, it was really the long tail. It was very few people after that. But we limited to first 1,000 events for maximum for each person. Some had a couple, some had a whole 1,000. So really quite a complex heterogeneous data set. And the objective was to create a synthetic variant of this data set and replicate a study that was published before. And so these are the Cox regression results for different outcomes. So the composite outcome, emergency department visits, hospitalization, death, and for one diagnosis code that was relevant is pneumonia. And these are all individuals who took a certain opioids. And as you can see, the conclusions would be the same, but and the confidence intervals are quite high for these estimates. And the estimates are for the model parameters around the whether someone took the opioid or not. So again, strong concordance between the real and synthetic data set. Now, the challenge with these studies is that they only looked at, here's another one, sorry, before I talk about a challenge. It's another study we did. This is a colon cancer control arm of a colon cancer clinical trial. And this was a 5-year survival. So this is overall survival, and you look at the hazard ratio between the real and synthetic data sets. And by and large, there was strong concordance. And at least in terms of the main conclusion, which the main study here was around bowel obstruction and the impact of bowel obstruction on survival, and that was predictable, was consistent between the real and synthetic data with a 61% confidence interval overlap, which is considered to be reasonably good. The challenge with these studies is that, and this is what most people do, is that they do a single analysis. They generate one synthetic data set, and then they draw conclusions from that. They generate one synthetic data set, do the analysis, and then compare the analysis on the one synthetic data set with the real data set. But what we've noticed is that there was variability in the results. So you check one synthetic data set, do the analysis, then generate another synthetic data set and do the analysis, and the results are not exactly the same because synthetic data generation is stochastic. So really the correct way to analyze synthetic data is kind of a multiple imputation approach. So you get the real data set, you generate synthetic data. We did a simulation mentioned later on. Basically, if you generate 10 synthetic data sets, and then there's a number of combining rules that you can use to combine the analysis results across the 10 data sets, and then once you combine the rule, the analysis results, you get the final analysis results, which are a lot more stable. So essentially factoring out the stochasticity that's introduced by the synthetic data generation process itself. And that turns out to be a much better way, and it's the correct way for, at least for drawing valid inferences, for analyzing synthetic data. So we did another study where we looked at 8 primarily breast cancer clinical trials, and we looked at utility and privacy. And we looked at 3 different types of generative models: sequential synthesis, generative adversarial networks, and variational autoencoders. So the last 2, GANs and VAEs, are types of deep learning models. And here are the trials: some small, some large, some single site, some multi-site, some national, some international, different sample sizes. And we looked at 3 criteria: estimate agreement, decision agreement, and confidence interval overlap. So estimate agreement is whether the direction and statistical significance, whether the parameter estimate on the synthetic data is within the 95% confidence interval of the real data. Decision agreement is whether the direction and statistical significance of the synthetic data is the same as the real data, and then confidence interval overlap, which we saw before. So 3 criteria that are typically used to look at replicability, that are used to compare real-world studies to RCTs, used to compare single-arm studies with the real-world data, so external controls with RCTs, etc. So they're commonly used criteria for evaluating replicability. However you define it, whether you're just replicating published studies or you're comparing different techniques like RCTs and real-world data analysis. So these are easily justifiable criteria for evaluating replicability. So what we found is that sequential synthesis worked really well for across the different studies, with consistently high estimate agreement and decision agreement, and pretty good confidence interval overlap from the perspective of utility, but the other methods, GANs and VAEs, were not performing consistently across different data sets. So that was interesting in that utility was different depending on the method that you're using, which is not completely surprising. Some methods work better in certain data sets than others. But now we're starting to get data on across multiple real data sets about which methods perform well under what conditions. And then here are the results on the attribution disclosure. We have a threshold that's based on some existing precedents regarding what's acceptable attribution disclosure risk, and all the methods produced low risk for attribution disclosure. For a sequential synthesis, the GAN and the VAE. And as you can see here, the risk measured is low, below the threshold across the board. And then membership disclosure. Again, for membership disclosure, one trial had very high membership disclosure because the trial represented more than 50% of the population. And we define the population as patients who participated in at the same time in the same geographies and trials in the same therapeutic area, and we use clinical trials that go for that purpose. So we're able to estimate the population, and CCTG at the time it ran the MA27 trial represented 57% of the population. So if you just guess that Sally was in the training data set, you'd be correct 57% of the time, which is higher than our threshold. So you had no chance. Like, membership disclosure is going to be high for this data set, whatever you do. But for all the other data sets here, membership disclosure was low across the board for all 3 types of generative models. So this was a large-scale evaluation of the utility and privacy risks evaluated, I think, in a better way, because we looked at utility accounting for the stochasticity of the synthesis itself, and then we evaluate utility and privacy as well. At the same time, we also want to look at population inferences. So even if if you are able to replicate the results of real data, are the population inferences you make from your synthetic data still valid? So in general, you have a population, you draw a random sample, and then you compute some sample statistic from your random sample, so ERS, and then you have the true value, unknown true value of your parameter from the population, or EP, and then from your sample you can run it through a generative model and create a synthetic sample as well, and then you compute synthetic data set. So basically what we wanted to do was to, what we've talked about so far was comparing those two. So are the parameters of the synthetic data comparable to the parameters from the real data on the sample? But now the other question we wanted to ask is, well, how good are the synthetic data parameter estimates comparable to the population values? Basically, how good is the inference from the synthetic data? So we did a simulation recently, and I'll just highlight a couple of things, because I think there's some interesting observations here. So this is looking at bias and power. Okay, so we want bias to be 0. Single here at the bottom, the legend means you did the analysis on a single synthetic data set only. So what we typically did before. And then multiple is where you use the multiple imputation approach, right? And I'll go to power first. So as you can see, and then the x-axis is the number of data sets. So we said like around 10 data sets. If you generate 10 data sets, then the results are pretty good. And from a power perspective, you can see that it starts to plateau at around 10, right? And then the top here is amplification. So this is, you generate synthetic data the same size as the real data, double the size, 5 times the size, and 10 times the size. And we wanted to evaluate whether amplification affects inferences as well. So the first thing that I'll say is amplification really has no impact, in that you're around 10, you're kind of at a plateau. 10 data sets, you're at a plateau, and you kind of reach the maximum power that you're going to reach with that data set. So power is quite close to the nominal level. It was 80%. So the simulations were designed for data sets sizes that are 80% power. So the nominal power is the power is quite close to the nominal value, but amplification doesn't really matter. And then bias, of course, you want it to be as close to 0 as possible. Again, at around 10 data sets, you kind of start to plateau, and your bias is kind of approaching 0 or very close to 0, but really amplification doesn't matter. So even though people talk about amplification as one of the use cases for synthetic data, it actually just crude amplification is not helpful if you do the correct adjustments. You have to create synthetic 10 synthetic data sets and make the adjustments to your standard errors in order to get valid inferences. If you don't do that, then you're essentially cheating. You're kind of creating power out of nothing, which doesn't make sense. So you have there's no amplification benefit from a bias or a power perspective, really. And our simulations show that this is one type of simulation of one data set, but we were getting similar results in other data sets. So that's really important. Like amplification using synthetic data, at least if you're doing statistical analysis, you're not going to get any. The benefits are very marginal. No power benefit, very little bias benefit, very little coverage benefit, etc. And here's some more results on coverage. So again, you see that coverage is around 95% for most of the time here. Close to the nominal level, and it's not affected by amplification. And then empirical standard error also, it's kind of close to 0 at around 10 data sets, it's close to the very, very close to the essentially plateaus. So we have evidence that if you analyze data correctly, that your inferences can also be valid. Now, this is using one type of generative model, sequential synthesis. We did the same analysis on other types of generative models, and the results were not as good. So again, the results really do depend on your generative model. It's not universal, like any generative model works equally well. We need to evaluate different types of generative models to determine which ones work well on different types of data sets. But we know that for certain types of generative models, and I can tell you which ones we keep getting consistent answers with, but certain types of generative models, we have accumulating evidence that the replicability is high, the privacy risks are low, and inferences are valid. So so we know that it can work. We know which methods tend to work better than others. I think we need more evidence to have more stability in those results in terms of which methods work better than others, and to have more consistent results, but we're getting there. We're getting a better understanding of how to evaluate privacy risks and how to do proper analysis of synthetic data. But again, it depends on the generative model that you're working on or that you're working with. That's just another kind of main conclusion from this work. The other conclusion is, well, what else can you do? So one other study we did with our colleagues at McGill is using it for distributed analysis when you have data distributed across multiple jurisdictions. So the context for this was study pulling data between Canada and Austria. It was between McGill and University of Vienna. So we had the CCHS data set, both of those, and the ATHIS data set from Statistics Austria. And so both these were harmonized, so that's fine. The Canadian data was synthesized. We did a privacy assessment here, number 3, and we demonstrated the synthetic data had low risk. Then we sent it to the Austrian team. The Austrian team, we sent actually 10 data sets, 10 synthetic data sets. And the Austrian team then combined each of these 10 data sets with their data. So we had 10 hybrid data sets, 10 data sets which were partially Austrian and partially synthetic Canadian. And then we did regression analysis. So the objective was to predict cardiovascular health using the Can-Hart index. And we did the regression analysis with the hybrid data set. And different types of models, main effects, attraction effects. We looked at whether country, one of the questions the researchers wanted to answer was whether there were country differences and sex differences. So they wanted to build models to test for those. Okay, so we have our hybrid analysis results. To get the ground truth, we implemented Data Shield, which is a kind of a distributed analysis system. The nice thing about Data Shield is that it doesn't distort the data. So you get pretty much the same results from Data Shield as you would had you pulled the original data. So we created a Data Shield node in McGill, we created a Data Shield node in Vienna, and then the two nodes talked to each other and performed a ground truth analysis. And then we compared the results. The objective here was to see whether, well, if we shared synthetic data, would we get the same results as if we had pooled the data? And we used the federated analysis as the ground truth. And the results were really encouraging in that. So remember, this is combining the results from 10 different data sets. And so this is one of the models. It was simple least squares regression with Can-Hart index as the outcome. And the parameter estimates were very similar. Significance was the same. Confidence intervals highly overlapping between the federated analysis result. And then the pooled analysis is essentially the hybrid data with the Austrian and the synthetic Canadian data sets. So we're able to get the same results. The main difference was that we did the synthetic data analysis. I mean, we did it in a week, really. We spent a couple of weeks validating the results afterwards. So if you count everything, say a few weeks, 3 weeks or so. And then setting up the federated analysis system took a year and a half. So that was the main difference, is why would you use federation compared to sharing synthetic data? Well, the reason is the advantage is not obvious because we have evidence that sharing synthetic data sets, you have the privacy advantage, but also it's just faster, much easier and faster, and you get the same results or same findings, same conclusions. So that was an interesting observation. And I can talk about, why federated analysis took so long and so, but it was really just a time-consuming activity to get those two nodes up and running and talking to each other. If we had more centers, more nodes, it may have taken longer, because every site required a whole process to get them to agree to put a node that is open, talking to another node with data, live data on it. Okay. The other interesting thing you can do with synthetic data is bias mitigation. So this is for real world data. We're not talking about clinical trials. Clinical trials are a completely different beast. So real world data sets, you have, let's say, two groups, in this case, men and women, and the distribution should be equal, but you have fewer women in the data set. So what you can do is you can take the complete data set, train a generative model, and then simulate additional female patients and add them to the data set, and then do the analysis of this augmented data with simulated patients to replace or to augment the underrepresented group in your data set. So we did a study to evaluate whether synthetic data can help with this, and we compared that to other methods that can be used for solving the same problem, propensity score matching, oversampling, undersampling, etc. And so the basic protocol was, and this is really important for the whole data set. We just took one chunk of the data set here, and that was the test set, and that was the test set for everything. So it was one test set carved out that was used for evaluating all the bias mitigation approaches and also for evaluating the ground truth. So we took each training data set, and we induced different types of bias, little bias, a lot of bias, marginal bias, conditional bias, and then evaluated undersampling, oversampling, SMOTE, propensity score matching, random forest type approach, and then SMAs are kind of name for our synthetic data generation method. And so then we use those to mitigate the bias, train logistic regression models. So this is all logistic regression, and then evaluated the augmented data model and compared it to the ground truth. And we used AUC, Brier score, odds ratios for the relevant parameter, confidence interval overlap, and then we computed some fairness metrics. So I'll show you some of the results of this just to give you a sense of what we found. So so the x-axis is the proportion of bias. There are three different types of bias: conditional, sorry. Okay, conditional bias, one, conditional bias two, and marginal bias. Marginal bias is you just remove patients from a single variable that we're targeting. Conditional biases, you assume there's a weak relationship between variables, and the bias two, you assume a strong relationship between variables. So your biasing is actually impacting multiple variables at the same time because they're correlated with the variable that you're removing patients from. So the main thing I think that to note is that for odds ratio for the parameter of interest, I'm almost done. It'll be the last slides. The parameter of interest, the more bias you introduce, the greater the deviation from the ground truth, right? As you can see it here, you can see it, starting to happen relatively quickly for marginal bias. Conditional bias, it kind of maintains. This is for one of the data sets, and then again for the minority class prediction accuracy, you can see that the bias tends to increase with time. So the biggest effects we saw were the parameter estimates. In terms of prediction accuracy, was okay. You have to have some pretty strong bias for prediction accuracy to be affected, but for parameter estimates, bias had a big impact relatively quickly. And then the bottom here are three different types of fairness metrics, and so fairness decreases or is affected quite rapidly by bias. So as you can see, as you introduce bias, your fairness tends to degrade quite quickly for different types of fairness metrics. And then we looked at bias mitigation. So random oversampling, sorry, keep pressing the wrong button here. For random oversampling, Okay, random oversampling is works better. Is one of the better methods. Actually, it's out of all the methods, and then here we're just showing the main result of random oversampling with synthetic data generation. And overall, synthetic data generation works a bit better than random oversampling, up to around 50% or so of bias. Higher than 50%, the performance was quite inconsistent. So synthetic data generation performs reasonably well. After 50%, it's really hard to know what works. Out of all the bias mitigation methods, some are good here, some are good there. It's unpredictable. So that's really the main finding. Basically, is if you train a generative model and use that to compensate for underrepresented groups, you can mitigate low to medium bias. And you can see it for different metrics for AUC here, for minority AUC, so area under the curve, the prediction accuracy for the underrepresented group, and it's able to maintain your performance, the performance up to better than random oversampling and close to where you want it to be, close to the ground truth, up to around medium bias, but at high and extreme bias, we couldn't find anything that worked consistent. But at least we have a solution to low and medium bias. It tends to work quite well. So we know that a bunch of other groups have taken this study and they're replicating it and they're trying different techniques. So hopefully in the next 6 to 12 months, we'll see better methods that can really chip away at this problem and identify good bias mitigation techniques. So the main point here is, we talked a lot about privacy and so on, but beyond data sharing, you have use cases where you can use it in a federated context for distributed data, where you can pull data sets in a reliable way, and then for bias mitigation. We're evaluating other use cases, so hopefully in the next little while we'll get more results on that. But we're starting to see other values beyond privacy for synthetic data generation and for these types of generative models. And that's a summary of what we've been up to so far. Thank you.